I now have the pleasure of introducing, I think he's adjunct professor, Jeremy Russell-Smith. We've heard from him before in past conferences. We know he will have something really useful to say from his perspective working at Charles Darwin University. Thank you.
Good morning, and I would respectfully also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this place and all who look after and care for land and country. I would also like to pay my respects to the Nature Conservation Council for their excellent work, and over the years I've had the privilege of coming to now 3 of your conferences, and other colleagues of mine have attended others. And I think you succeed in ways that we would be very keen to try to emulate in other parts of the country. Well done. I work these days at an institution called the Darwin Centre for Bushfire Research, and it's a partnership between a university, the Northern Territory Government and related governments in Northern Australia, and the North Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance. And our particular interest is not so much fire research, it's about looking at developing opportunities for sustainable livelihoods. And as I'm going to point out through this talk, there's much scope in our part of the world for using environmental services, particularly carbon at the present time, for that. But into the future, I think there is even more scope for these parts of the world where maybe fire extent and frequency is not so great as in our landscape. This is a map you've seen increasingly, and it shows that the north is the most fire-prone part of a very fire-prone land. Got to understand this is the scale of AVHRR imagery, 1.1 kilometre pixel sizes, so you don't get all the small fires included, but it does get those 2002-03 fires, which probably burnt around between 20 and 30,000 square kilometres. In the north, we get about, on average, depending on seasons, 350,000 to 450,000 kilometres squared burnt each year. Tasmania is 60,000 square kilometres. Gives you some idea of the problem that we have. The savannas comprise about a quarter of the nation. There's relatively few people who live there. There's about 700,000 people live in that landscape. Mostly, the great majority of those are in towns. Outside the towns, Aboriginal people are the major part of the population, and the land is ostensibly given over to much pastoral production. And you've got all the fine-grained cadastre of sort of sheep farming in this part of the world, remembering that that part of the world is in terrible drought at the present time. And then the large sizes of properties across here. And the issue is that much of this sort of land, the Barkly and the Gulf, there's a lot of cattle, there's not much fire. If we were to go back to the preceding image, see there's not much fire in those parts of the landscapes. But across the remainder, fire eats the fuel. Just to make the simple point that much of the land in the north is indigenous land, claimed through native title or title underway. So we have 2 tenure systems in place. But I think the big challenge for us in the north is developing sustainable outcomes for people and really finding opportunities for particularly Indigenous people who have much of the land but don't have much of the arable land, and we need to find other ways to support that management. This illustrates the issue pretty nicely that we have. We've got a bit of burning in the early dry season around Darwin, but much of the country is burnt under pretty severe late dry season conditions. Obviously, particularly in Cape York. And if we were to take the higher rainfall area across the top there, that's burning on average over 50% per annum, but most of that's in the late dry season. As you go further south, it's about down to 30% of the landscape burn. These are the sort of fires that we would like to see, and small, patchy, early dry season fires, leading to much patchiness and pyrodiversity in the landscape. And I will emphasise pyrodiversity as opposed to the comments from yesterday, because in contrast, this has to be ecologically more benign than these sorts of situations which burn over very extensive areas each year. This is in Kakadu National Park. And the point I'd like to make is that over 80% of fire extent in these landscapes is attributable fires that are greater than 1,000 kilometres squared. That's a pretty staggering statistic. And how can small animals, let alone microbiota and the like, survive frequent intense fires like this? So I think there is an issue of pyrodiversity at scale that needs to be addressed, and our scales are totally out of kilter. Over many years, we've been looking for economic solutions to try to address this fire management problem and actually turn it into an opportunity. And since 2000, I and a whole raft of colleagues, scientists and indigenous, have been working particularly on this first of the greenhouse gas abatement methodologies. And the simple story is here: if you could reduce the extent of more intense late dry season fires and get more benign early dry season fires, you're going to substantially reduce the amount of emissions that come off it. I mean, just the amount of fuel that's burnt for a start. And under the international accounting rules, we can only account for methane and nitrous oxide. That delivers between 2 to 4% of Australia's national accounts, greenhouse inventory accounts each year. If we were allowed to account for CO2, that would be of the order of about a third of the national inventories. Leslie yesterday indicated that there's the supposition that what gets burnt in one burning season gets fixed in the vegetation the next, and that's largely correct, but CO2 is out there in the atmosphere for a damn long time before it's fixed again, and it is recognised as a weakness in the international rules. But perhaps more importantly, I think we totally underestimate the significance of emissions coming from these savanna fires accordingly. So in about 2012, we had that methodology approved through the Australian government, and a whole lot of businesses set up to trade on that, and I'll come back to that later. We've also been working on 2 other methodologies, because if you change the fire regime to one that's more benign, you are going to get more incorporation of and sustaining of organic matter in the living biomass, in the non-living biomass, particularly in the trees. And by the end of this year, this particular methodology will be also available for land managers in the north, and that one's a couple of years away. But I should point out that collectively, the market from those types of methodologies would substantially dwarf the income generable from pastoralism in the north. We're talking about a totally new industry. So just to remind you of the space we're working in, and there's two isoheights on that map. One is the 1,000 millimetres, which is the high rainfall savannas. The other is the 600 millimetres. And that's the southern extent of the methodologies to date. We are working on other ones into Central Australia, and they are prospective, but the amount of country that needs to be managed to get the abatement and sequestration return is very substantial and probably logistically prohibitive. Much of this work came out of a program in Western Arnhem Land. It was WAFMA, it's called there. That's actually the agreement with ConocoPhillips, who entered into a 17-year contract arrangement with the traditional owners to deliver fire abatement over a 28,000 square kilometre area. That area also incorporates a very substantial bit of country in here, which is northern heathlands. It's an endangered community, and the threatening process is obviously fire. This program basically started at the behest of traditional owners in 1996, and I was privileged to be at that particular meeting. And all these guys are here in that photograph are deceased. I do have permission to show that photograph. But the guy in the foreground was a very inspiring guy. He famous artist, didn't speak much English, but was the main driver of trying to get fire management back onto country in Western Arnhem Land. And that led to a whole series of meetings and processes that went on, planning to get the Walfa project up, which by 2004 started to enter into this arrangement with ConocoPhillips. It's basically about delivering a whole lot of on-ground burning, but given there are effectively no tracks or roads through this landscape, 28,000 square kilometres, much of it has to be delivered strategically using aerial means and helicopters. This whole program is run by traditional owners. The results have been stunning. And on the right-hand side, you see Walfa. That's the fire scars at the end of 2014. Note the small green patchy bits. That's all the stuff done in the early dry season. This is totally in accord with the traditional way of burning country. There are 6 traditional seasons. The one in the middle of the year, which you would equate with winter, is called wurging. Wurging, the root is to burn. Wurg is to burn. It's the burning season. So much of the country needs to be burnt at that time. It's totally coincident with the way ecologically country should be managed, the way white fellas in Northern Australia should think about managing. And there's been, again, through Walfa, a total transformation of the way policy has changed. By contrast, if you look Kakadu National Park, World Heritage Property, big slabs of country there on its western boundary, burnt by these large, extensive fires which are typical of the north. And Kakadu, as with the other major national parks, are failing dismally. And our only belief in this is that, firstly, they should engage more seriously with their traditional owners and, in fact, contract them to deliver more effective fire management programs using these carbon methodologies actually as the engine to drive it. Because in their defence, those national park organisations have very limited resources and are dwindling. I won't go into this in much detail, but the this is just what's happened in Walfer over the period of 2006 to the present. And these orange bars show the proportion of burning that was done in the late dry season relative to the early dry season. So you can see there was very much a late dry season unmanaged regime. Come ConocoPhillips starting to talk in here, we start to see the whole fire regime turn around to one that's early dry season dominated. And the resultant emissions from that 10-year baseline prior to the Walfer project now at that sort of level thereafter. I'm not going to go obviously into the calculation methodologies. At the end of 2014 or start of 2015 there were 34 registered fire and carbon projects across Northern Australia, all in that higher rainfall area, mostly on Aboriginal land, but it wasn't confined to Aboriginal land. And these projects are tenure blind. They can be undertaken on national parks, defence lands, you name it. And the last slide is perhaps where I really wanted to get to in this talk, is that currently we've been looking at the opportunities available through carbon management. I often say, and I will repeat here, that we don't really give a stuff about carbon issues realistically. I know that's a terrible thing to have to say, but it's the means to the end for us to try to get better land management outcomes. Under the former government, we had the Carbon Farming Initiative, and those 5 projects prospered very well and delivered, for example, in Arnhem Land, sums of over $10 million per annum. We're talking large numbers. And now we have a new government with a different sort of philosophy that the taxpayer should pay for other people's pollution. And it's going to be much more difficult to get similar successes under the ERF as it was under the CFI. You've got to, for savanna burning projects, you've got to enter into 7-year contracts. They're not indexed for inflation. It's a pretty low price. It's pretty mean world, I think, actually. We would hope that in the future, the market mechanisms should be revisited to make this a better playing field for people. But we do understand that delivering carbon is not the be-all and end-all. What we're after is better environmental management, and we see carbon simply as delivering an ecosystem service, and there are many other services which need to be delivered for biodiversity, water, cultural issues, and we have over the last few years begun seriously to look at the bottom level of issues in that slide relating to what we sort of put under the text of diversification. Diversification is simply to say that we recognise that the pastoral industry in the north isn't going to be the saviour for people, that they need to really think about other systems of ecosystem services, and we have a partnership that involves the very largest pastoral companies in the land, the major indigenous groups, conservation groups, NGOs, looking at how we can actually start to set out developing a market-based process at looking at biodiversity benefits and the like. Now, you might think that's all pie in the sky. 15 years ago, when we started to talk about carbon markets, that was pie in the sky. So we actually feel that there's a great traction to pursue this line, and it's got widespread stakeholder support across the north. And I would suggest it's in that sort of vein that one should be trying to look at a diversification of benefits in your part of the world too. Thanks very much.